The winter in Montana was brutal that year. Snow covered the empty roads, the wind howled through quiet fields, and most people stayed inside where it was warm. But one man walked through the cold every morning. A former Navy veteran named Michael Carter, with only his loyal German Shepherd beside him. He was working 3 jobs, day and night, trying to save enough money for one thing: his father's life. What no one in town knew was how close he was to losing everything. Until one freezing night, when Michael collapsed in the snow, and the only one who could help him was his dog. Before we continue, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? And if stories about loyalty, courage, and second chances mean something to you, consider subscribing to the channel. The town of Redstone, Montana, sat quietly between wide stretches of open land and low, dark hills that rolled toward the horizon. It was late October, and winter was already creeping into the air. Cold winds swept down from the mountains, pushing dry leaves along the empty sidewalks. The sky hung low and gray most mornings, and the sun rarely stayed long enough to warm the ground. Redstone had never been a big town. A few thousand people lived there at most. There was one grocery store, 2 diners, a hardware shop, and a small hospital that served the entire county. Life moved slowly in Redstone. People knew each other's names, and they noticed when someone disappeared for too long. On a chilly morning, a battered pickup truck rolled down the narrow road that led into town. Dust trailed behind it as the tires moved over gravel. Behind the wheel sat Michael Carter, a man who looked like he carried more years on his shoulders than his age suggested. Michael was 38 years old, tall at about 6 feet, with broad shoulders built from years of military training. His face was sharply defined, strong jawline, slightly hollow cheeks, and a faint scar that ran along his left eyebrow, a quiet reminder of a mission that had gone wrong years ago. His dark brown hair was cut short, military style, though it had begun to show small streaks of gray near the temples. A trimmed beard framed his mouth, giving him a rugged look that fit his quiet personality. Michael didn't speak much, especially around people he didn't know. Years in the Navy had shaped him into someone calm, observant, and steady under pressure. But the same years had also left him with a habit of scanning every room and every road as if danger could appear at any moment. In the passenger seat sat a large German Shepherd. The dog lifted its head as the truck slowed. This was Rex. Rex was nearly 5 years old, with thick black and tan fur and alert amber eyes that seemed to understand far more than an ordinary dog. His body was strong and athletic, the result of years of training and work beside Michael. One of his ears had a small notch at the edge, an old injury from a mission overseas when shrapnel had cut through the air near them. Unlike many dogs, Rex rarely barked without reason. He watched, he listened, and most of all, he stayed close to Michael. They had been through things together most people would never understand. Michael slowed the truck as they passed the old town sign, "Welcome to Redstone." He stared at it for a moment before driving on. "Home again," he muttered quietly. Rex shifted in the seat and looked toward him, tail thumping softly once against the seat. Michael parked outside a small, aging house at the edge of town. The house had once belonged to his family. The white paint on the wooden walls had faded and peeled over time, and the front porch leaned slightly to one side. The yard was mostly dry grass, though a few stubborn weeds still pushed through the soil. Michael stepped out of the truck, the cold wind immediately cutting through his jacket. Rex jumped down beside him. For a moment, Michael simply stood there, staring at the house. Memories moved through his mind like distant echoes, running through the yard as a boy, his father fixing things in the garage, his younger brother following him everywhere. But those days felt very far away now. Life after the Navy had not turned out the way Michael imagined. He had returned to Redstone 6 months earlier after leaving active duty. There had been talk of opportunities, steady work, maybe even a fresh start. Instead, he found himself taking whatever job he could get. Most nights, Michael worked as a security guard at a storage warehouse on the edge of town. The job paid just enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. The warehouse was quiet, often painfully quiet, and the long hours gave Michael far too much time to think. During the day, he tried to sleep, but sleep didn't always come easily. Some mornings, when the memories felt too loud, Michael would grab a jacket, whistle softly, and head out the door. Rex always followed. The dirt road behind the house stretched toward open fields and scattered pine trees. It was quiet there, far from the town center. Michael jogged slowly along the road while Rex ran ahead, then circled back, always keeping an eye on him. The cold air filled Michael's lungs as he ran. For those few miles every morning, life felt simple. No orders, no missions, no distant explosions echoing in his memory. Just the sound of boots on dirt and a dog running beside him. One morning, after finishing their run, Michael sat on the wooden steps outside the house. Rex lay down beside him, panting lightly. Michael rubbed the dog's neck. "You're the only one who still enjoys mornings," he said quietly. Rex responded by leaning his head against Michael's leg. The moment was peaceful. But it didn't last long. Michael's phone began to ring in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen. Lucas. Michael frowned slightly before answering. His younger brother rarely called early. "Hey," Michael said. For a moment, there was only breathing on the other end of the line. Then Lucas spoke. "Mike, I think you should come over." Lucas Carter was 32, shorter than Michael, but with a similar face. He had sandy blonde hair that he often forgot to comb properly, and a narrow frame that made him look younger than he was. Unlike Michael, Lucas had never left Redstone. He worked as a mechanic in a small auto repair shop near town. Lucas was friendly and talkative, the kind of person who could make conversation with anyone. But beneath that easy personality was someone who worried deeply about family. And right now, his voice sounded strained. "What's going on?" Michael asked. Lucas hesitated. "I was cleaning out Dad's place," he said. "The old desk in the living room." Michael felt a slight tightening in his chest. "And?" Lucas inhaled slowly. "I found something." Michael stood up. "What kind of something?" There was a long pause. Then Lucas said the words quietly. "A hospital diagnosis." The cold wind seemed sharper suddenly. "What diagnosis?" Michael asked. Lucas's voice dropped even lower. "Cancer." Michael didn't speak for several seconds. Rex stood up and watched him carefully. Lucas continued. "It says lung cancer, early stage. The paper's from 3 months ago." Michael's jaw tightened. "Does Dad know we found it?" "I don't think he knows I've seen it yet," Lucas said. "But Mike, he's been coughing a lot lately." Michael ran a hand across his face. Their father, Robert Carter, was a stubborn man. He was 68 years old, tall but thinner than he used to be. His once dark hair had turned almost completely gray, and deep lines marked the corners of his eyes. Robert had spent most of his life working as a carpenter. His hands were rough, his voice firm, and he believed strongly in solving problems on his own. He hated being a burden. Michael already knew what that meant. Their father had probably received the diagnosis and simply decided not to tell anyone. "I'm coming over," Michael said. "Okay," Lucas replied quietly. Michael ended the call. Rex looked up at him. Michael grabbed his jacket and keys. "Let's go, boy." They drove across town to Robert's small house. Lucas was already waiting outside. He stood beside an old sedan, holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. His shoulders were tense. When Michael stepped out of the truck, Lucas handed him the paper silently. Michael unfolded it. The words at the top were clear. "Lung cancer diagnosis.
Stage: early. Recommended treatment: surgery. Estimated cost: $90,000 plus. Michael stared at the number for a long time. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck nervously.
"What do we do?" he asked. Later that afternoon, the two brothers convinced their father to visit the hospital for another examination. The doctor who met them was Dr. Emily Parker, a woman in her early 40s with calm blue eyes and neatly tied auburn hair. She spoke gently but directly, the way experienced doctors often did. After reviewing the tests, she confirmed the diagnosis. "The cancer is still in an early stage," she explained. "That's good news." Michael leaned forward slightly. "And the bad news?" Dr. Parker folded her hands. "Your father will need surgery soon if we want the best chance of recovery." Lucas swallowed. "How much will it cost?" Dr. Parker hesitated briefly before answering. "Around $90,000. The room fell silent. Robert Carter shook his head slowly. "Forget it," he said. "That's too much." Michael looked at him. "Dad." Robert raised a hand. "I'm not letting you boys ruin your lives paying for an old man's problems." Michael didn't respond immediately. Rex sat quietly beside his chair. Michael finally looked at Lucas, then back at his father. His voice was calm. "I'll handle it." Lucas blinked. "Mike?" Michael shook his head once. "I said I'll handle it." Rex moved closer and gently placed his head on Michael's knee. Michael rested a hand on the dog's head. Outside the hospital window, the cold Montana wind continued to blow. And Michael Carter realized that the hardest battle of his life might be just beginning. The cold in Redstone grew harsher as November pushed deeper into Montana. Morning frost covered the empty fields like a thin sheet of glass, and the wind sweeping down from the mountains carried a bite sharp enough to sting the skin. The town's few streets looked quieter than ever, as if winter had slowly convinced people to stay indoors whenever possible. For Michael Carter, however, staying indoors was no longer an option. The promise he had made inside that hospital room still echoed in his mind. "I'll handle it." $90,000. The number felt like a mountain standing directly in front of him. But Michael Carter had spent years in the Navy facing impossible situations. And one thing the military had carved into his bones was simple. When the mission looked impossible, you worked harder. So Michael began to work. Every hour he could find, every job he could take. Every day he woke before sunrise, when the cold air still held the quiet darkness of night. His new daytime job was with Barton Roofing, a small construction crew that repaired roofs across Redstone and the surrounding farms. The company belonged to Jack Barton, a thick-built man in his mid-50s with a wide chest and powerful arms that suggested he had spent most of his life carrying lumber and climbing ladders. Jack had a heavy gray beard that spread across his jaw like rough steel wool, and his voice always sounded like gravel rolling inside a metal bucket. But beneath the rough appearance, Jack was known around town as a fair man. He hired workers who needed second chances. When Michael walked into his office asking for work, Jack had studied him carefully. "You ever work roofs before?" Jack had asked. Michael shrugged. "Not really." Jack pointed at Michael's shoulders. "You Navy, right?" Michael nodded. Jack leaned back in his chair. "You're probably tougher than half the guys I've hired. Start tomorrow." And just like that, Michael had a second job. The work was brutal. Climbing ladders in the freezing wind, carrying heavy bundles of shingles across slanted rooftops, hammering nails with stiff fingers that barely felt the cold anymore. But Michael never complained. During lunch breaks, the other workers sometimes sat inside their trucks to warm up. Michael stayed outside with Rex, sharing a sandwich with the dog while staring at the open fields around them. Rex had quickly become familiar with the crew. The German Shepherd often sat quietly near the work trucks, watching everything with alert, amber eyes. His thick coat helped him handle the cold far better than most people. Some of the workers joked that Rex looked like a soldier guarding the job site. And in many ways, he was. After finishing the roofing work around late afternoon, Michael rarely went home. Instead, he drove straight to the warehouse on the edge of town where he worked as a night security guard. The warehouse belonged to a shipping company that stored farm equipment and machine parts before transporting them across the state. The building itself was enormous, a dull gray structure surrounded by chain-link fencing and long rows of parked trailers. Michael's supervisor there was Carl Jenkins, a tall, thin man in his early 60s with narrow shoulders and thick glasses that constantly slid down his nose. Carl walked slowly, due to an old knee injury from decades earlier when he had worked as a delivery driver. Carl was quiet, patient, and always grateful when someone showed up on time. "You're the most reliable guard I've had in years," Carl once told Michael. Michael simply nodded. Reliability had become his way of surviving. Rex accompanied him during the long night shifts, patrolling the quiet property together. Most nights passed without incident. But one night in early December, Rex suddenly stiffened. The dog's ears rose sharply. A low growl vibrated deep in his throat. Michael immediately turned toward the far end of the fence line. A man was stumbling near the locked gate. The stranger looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a dirty coat and moving with the uneven steps of someone who had clearly drunk far too much. His face was red from alcohol and cold wind. Before Michael could say anything, Rex barked loudly. The man froze. "Hey, this place ain't open," Michael called out. The drunk man stared at the large German shepherd and immediately backed away. Within seconds, he disappeared into the darkness of the road. Carl later told Michael that someone had tried breaking into the warehouse the week before. "If it wasn't for that dog," Carl said, adjusting his glasses, "we might have had a real problem." But even with 2 jobs, the numbers still didn't add up. Michael began accepting small jobs wherever he could find them. He repaired broken fences for farmers. He helped unload supply trucks behind the grocery store. He shoveled snow from sidewalks and driveways when winter storms passed through town. And wherever Michael went, Rex followed. One afternoon, while repairing a wooden fence behind a small ranch house, Michael suddenly realized something. His wallet was gone. He searched his jacket, his truck, the ground around him. Nothing. Losing his wallet meant losing his ID, his bank cards, everything. Michael stood silently for a moment, thinking. Then Rex began sniffing the ground near the truck. The dog moved slowly along the dirt path, nose low. After a few seconds, Rex stopped beside a pile of wooden boards. The wallet lay half hidden beneath them. Michael exhaled slowly and rubbed Rex behind the ears. "Good work, partner." The weeks passed like that. Work, drive, work again, sleep for a few hours, repeat. The exhaustion began creeping into Michael's body. His shoulders felt heavier each morning. The muscles in his back burned constantly. But he kept going. Because every few days he transferred a little more money into a savings account labeled simply Dad. By mid-December, the Montana winter turned brutal. One evening after finishing his warehouse shift, Michael accepted a last-minute job clearing snow at a ranch nearly 10 miles outside town. The ranch sat alone in a wide-open field, surrounded by long wooden fences and empty pasture land. Snow fell heavily from the sky, covering everything in white silence. Michael shoveled for nearly 2 hours. The wind howled across the land, cutting through his jacket. His arms grew slower. His breathing became heavier. Rex watched him carefully from near the truck. Michael drove the shovel into the snow again, and suddenly, the world tilted. The shovel slipped from his hands. Michael collapsed into the snow. The freezing ground rushed up to meet him. Rex ran to him immediately. The German shepherd barked loudly, circling his owner. Michael didn't move. The wind swallowed Rex's bark, but the dog didn't stop. Rex sprinted toward the distant barn. Light glowed faintly inside. The dog barked again, and again. Someone inside the barn finally stepped out into the storm. The figure of a tall, older man appeared in the doorway. The man squinted into the blowing snow, trying to understand what the dog wanted. Rex barked and ran back toward Michael's fallen body. The man followed. Moments later, he reached the spot where Michael lay half buried in snow. The man knelt beside him, checking his pulse. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Then he looked at Rex. "You came to get me, didn't you?" The dog stood beside Michael, breathing hard but refusing to leave his side. The man straightened slowly. And that was the moment Daniel Harris, the owner of the ranch, first noticed the exhausted veteran and his fiercely loyal dog. The storm had slowed by the time Daniel Harris managed to drag Michael Carter into the warmth of the barn. Snow still blew through the open fields outside, but inside the barn, the air smelled of dry hay and warm animals. A single yellow lamp hung from a wooden beam overhead, casting long shadows across the ground. Michael lay on a pile of old blankets near the wall. His face was pale from the cold, and frost clung to the edges of his jacket. Beside him sat Rex, the German shepherd, refusing to move more than a few inches away. Daniel Harris crouched down, pressing two rough fingers against Michael's neck to check his pulse again. "Still there," the old man muttered. Daniel Harris was 72 years old, but he carried himself like someone who had spent most of his life working outdoors. He stood tall despite his age, with long shoulders and arms hardened by decades of ranch work. His face was weathered by wind and sun, deep lines cutting across his cheeks and forehead. A thick gray mustache covered his upper lip, and his steel-colored eyes still held a sharpness that suggested a man who missed very little. Years earlier, Daniel had served in the U.S. Army during the late years of the Cold War, working as a logistics officer overseas. The military had shaped his habits: discipline, patience, and a quiet respect for anyone who had worn a uniform. When Rex had appeared in the barn doorway barking into the storm, Daniel had almost ignored it. But the dog's persistence, and the way he kept running back toward the snow, had convinced him something was wrong. Now he understood. Daniel looked down at the dog sitting beside Michael. "You didn't leave him," he said quietly. Rex stared back, ears alert. After a few minutes, Michael groaned slightly and opened his eyes. The barn ceiling came into focus slowly. He pushed himself up halfway before Daniel placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Easy there," Daniel said. "You nearly froze yourself solid out there." Michael blinked, trying to clear the fog from his mind. "Rex," he muttered. The dog immediately leaned forward, tail wagging gently. Michael exhaled in relief and rubbed Rex's neck. "You got help." Daniel crossed his arms. "Your dog did more than that. He practically dragged me into the storm." Michael slowly sat up. "I'm sorry about the trouble." Daniel gave a short snort. "If a man collapses on my land in a blizzard, I'd call that my business." He studied Michael more closely. "You military?" Michael nodded. "Navy." Daniel's expression softened slightly. "Thought so." For the next half hour, Michael explained why he had been working so many jobs. The hospital, his father's surgery, the $90,000. Daniel listened without interrupting, leaning against a wooden post with his arms folded. When Michael finished, the barn grew quiet again. Daniel finally scratched his beard thoughtfully. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been needing help around this place." Michael looked up. The ranch stretched across hundreds of acres outside Redstone. The land was wide and open, dotted with wooden fences and low barns scattered across the fields.
Running a place like that alone wasn't easy, especially for someone in his 70s. Daniel continued. My ranch manager quit 2 months ago. Said the winters were too rough. He glanced toward the snow-covered fields outside. Can't say I blame him. Michael remained silent. Daniel pushed himself off the post and walked a few steps closer. I'll make you an offer. Michael raised an eyebrow. You stay here and work as temporary ranch manager until spring. Michael frowned slightly. I don't know anything about running a ranch. Daniel shrugged. You know how to work hard. That's about 80% of the job. He continued. I'll pay you better than that roofing crew, and you can stay in the cabin near the south pasture. Michael hesitated. Daniel added one more detail.
No rent. Michael's eyes narrowed slightly. And the pay? Daniel named a number. It was nearly double what Michael earned working both jobs in town. Michael leaned back, thinking. Rex stood beside him, watching the older man carefully. Daniel noticed. That dog of yours looks like he's smarter than most ranch hands I've hired. Michael gave the faintest hint of a smile. He probably is. After a long pause, Michael nodded. All right. Daniel extended a rough hand. Welcome to Harris Ranch. Michael shook it. And just like that, his life changed direction again. The cabin Daniel had mentioned sat about 200 yards from the main barn. It was small but solid, built from thick pine logs years earlier. A wood stove warmed the inside, and the single window looked out over a long stretch of pasture land. For Michael and Rex, it felt almost peaceful. The work began the very next morning. Running a ranch required far more than Michael had imagined. The first task was repairing the horse barn, where several boards had rotted from years of weather exposure. Michael spent days replacing beams and reinforcing the structure before winter storms could damage it further. Next came the fences. Miles of wooden fencing surrounded the ranch, and many sections had collapsed under the weight of old snowstorms. Michael hauled posts, hammered nails, and stretched new wire until his arms burned. Rex followed him everywhere. The dog quickly learned the rhythm of ranch life. Whenever cattle wandered too far from the pasture, Rex circled them with careful movements, guiding them back toward the herd. Daniel watched the first time it happened. Well, I'll be, he muttered. You train him for that? Michael shook his head. He just figured it out. Rex also proved useful during the long nights. One evening, while Michael checked the barns, Rex suddenly froze near the fence line. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Michael followed his gaze. Two dark shapes moved near the trees beyond the pasture. Wolves. They stayed just outside the fence, watching the cattle. Rex barked sharply. The wolves retreated into the darkness. Daniel heard the noise and stepped outside with a lantern. After Michael explained what happened, the old rancher gave Rex a long look. That dog's worth his weight in gold, he said. Winter continued, but the work never stopped. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Michael saved every dollar he earned. By early March, the snow began melting across Montana. And for the first time since the hospital visit, Michael looked at his bank account and realized something incredible. He was close. Very close. Just a little more money, and he would have enough to pay for his father's surgery. But Montana winters rarely ended quietly. And one night, dark clouds gathered over the ranch as the wind began to howl across the fields. Daniel stepped onto the porch, staring toward the horizon. A powerful late-season blizzard was rolling in. Inside the cabin, Michael didn't know it yet, but the storm about to arrive would test everything he had worked for. The wind arrived first. It came screaming across the plains of Montana, like a warning that something powerful was on its way. By late afternoon, the sky above Harris Ranch had darkened into a thick blanket of gray clouds that rolled endlessly across the horizon. Inside the small cabin near the south pasture, Michael Carter stood by the window, watching the distant tree line sway violently. The weather radio on the wooden table crackled with static before the voice of the announcer came through. Severe winter storm warning across northern Montana. Blizzard conditions expected overnight with high winds and heavy snowfall. Michael exhaled slowly. Montana storms were never something to take lightly. Behind him, Rex lifted his head from the floor. The German shepherd's ears tilted forward as if he understood the tension in the air. His thick coat had grown even fuller during the long winter months, and the black and tan fur along his back rose slightly whenever the wind rattled the cabin walls. Rex was nearly 6 years old now, still powerful and alert. His amber eyes moved constantly, reading every small shift in Michael's posture. "Looks like we're in for a rough one tonight," Michael muttered. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. By nightfall, the storm had fully arrived. Wind roared across the open land like an ocean crashing against invisible cliffs. Snow blasted sideways through the darkness, covering fences, roads, and pastures in a swirling white storm. The lights inside the ranch buildings flickered as the power struggled against the weather. Michael pulled on his thick winter jacket and stepped outside the cabin. The cold struck his face instantly. Across the yard, the large barn stood like a dark shadow against the storm. Michael had just turned toward the main house when he heard it. A loud cracking sound, wood splintering. Then a deep crashing noise echoed across the ranch. Michael spun around. Part of the livestock shelter near the far pasture had collapsed. "Damn," he muttered. Rex barked sharply beside him. Without hesitation, Michael ran toward the pasture. The snow was already ankle-deep, and the wind made it nearly impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. Each step felt like pushing through invisible walls of ice and air. The beam of his flashlight cut through the swirling snow. Then he heard it. A weak cry. The frightened sound of a young calf. Michael pushed forward. When he reached the damaged shelter, the sight made his chest tighten. Part of the wooden roof had caved in under the weight of the snow. Broken beams and splintered boards lay scattered across the ground. And beneath the debris, a small brown calf struggled weakly, one of its legs pinned under a fallen support beam. Michael rushed toward it. But the storm made everything nearly impossible to see. The snow whipped across his face, blinding him. "Easy," Michael said softly to the animal. But he couldn't find the exact spot where the beam had trapped the calf. The wind howled louder. Then Rex barked. The German shepherd had circled around the wreckage. His nose pressed against the snow-covered wood as he sniffed quickly. Then he barked again, short, sharp. Michael moved toward the sound. "There you are." Rex stood directly beside the trapped calf, pawing lightly at the snow covering the beam. Michael dropped to one knee and grabbed the heavy piece of wood. It didn't move. The beam was thicker than it looked. Michael clenched his jaw and pulled harder. The wood shifted slightly, but not enough. The calf cried again. Behind them, the rest of the weakened shelter groaned under the weight of the storm. Michael knew it could collapse completely at any moment. He repositioned his grip and pulled again with everything he had. His muscles burned from months of labor, but the beam finally lifted just enough. "Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth. Rex barked again, encouraging the frightened animal. The calf struggled, sliding its leg free from beneath the beam. Michael released the wood and quickly guided the small animal away from the wreckage. Just seconds later, the remaining section of the shelter roof collapsed entirely. The crash echoed through the storm. Michael stumbled backward, breathing heavily. Rex stood beside him, tail raised, scanning the dark pasture. From the direction of the main house, a lantern beam suddenly appeared through the snow. Daniel Harris approached slowly, fighting against the wind. The old rancher wore a heavy coat and thick gloves, his gray mustache now covered in tiny crystals of ice. "What in God's name happened out here?" he shouted over the storm. Michael gestured toward the ruined shelter. Roof gave out. Daniel's sharp eyes moved from the broken structure to the calf now standing safely beside Michael. Then he looked at Rex. The dog stood proudly, chest out, snow dusting his fur. Daniel nodded slowly. You two saved it. Michael shrugged slightly. Just doing the job. Daniel studied the destroyed shelter again. If that calf had died, the rest of the herd might have panicked and scattered in this storm. He shook his head. That would have been a disaster. The three of them stood in the swirling snow for a moment before Daniel gestured toward the barn. Let's get that calf somewhere warm. The storm finally ended sometime near dawn. The next morning, pale sunlight broke through the clouds, revealing the ranch buried under a thick blanket of fresh snow. Michael walked across the yard toward the main house. Rex trotted beside him, leaving deep paw prints in the powder. Daniel Harris was already standing on the porch. The old rancher held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand. Morning, he said. Michael nodded. Daniel stepped down from the porch and walked toward him. I watched what you did last night. Michael shrugged. Anyone would have done the same. Daniel shook his head. No, most people would have waited for the storm to pass. He looked down at Rex, and most dogs would have run for shelter. Rex wagged his tail slowly. Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to Michael. Michael opened it. Inside was a check. The amount made him freeze. It was enough. More than enough to cover the entire cost of Robert Carter's surgery. Michael stared at Daniel in disbelief. I can't take this, he said quietly. Daniel folded his arms. You earned it. Michael shook his head. It's too much. Daniel's voice turned firm. You didn't just save a calf last night. He gestured toward the ranch stretching across the snowy land. You saved the herd from panic, and possibly half my operation. He nodded once. That ranch feeds 3 families every year. Michael looked down at the check again. For months he had chased that number like a distant horizon. Now it was suddenly in his hands. Beside him, Rex sat calmly in the snow. His tail brushed slowly back and forth across the ground. Michael rubbed the dog's head. And for the first time since the hospital visit, hope felt real. Spring arrived slowly in Montana. The snow that had once buried Harris Ranch in white silence began to melt under the gentle warmth of the sun. Thin streams of water ran along the dirt roads, and the open fields slowly returned to shades of brown and pale green. The wind still carried a chill, but it no longer felt harsh. For Michael Carter, the world finally seemed to be changing. A few weeks after the blizzard, Michael stood in the parking lot of Redstone County Hospital, staring at the modest brick building that served most of the surrounding towns. The envelope Daniel Harris had given him rested in the inside pocket of his jacket. Inside that envelope had been the check that made everything possible. Next to him stood his younger brother, Lucas Carter. Lucas looked different from the last time Michael had seen him at the hospital months earlier. The stress that had once tightened his face had softened slightly, though worry still lingered in his eyes. Lucas was dressed in a worn denim jacket, his sandy blonde hair messy from running his hands through it too many times that morning. You sure about this? Lucas asked quietly. Michael nodded once. Yeah. They both turned toward the hospital entrance. Inside the building, their father was preparing for surgery. Robert Carter, once a strong carpenter known throughout Redstone for his skill with wood and tools, had grown thinner over the past few months. His shoulders were still broad, but the illness had slowly drained some of the strength from his body. Robert had always been a proud man. His hands were rough and scarred from decades of construction work, and he believed strongly that a man should stand on his own feet without asking for help. That belief had been the reason he kept his illness secret in the first place. He never wanted his sons to carry his burden. But now, the truth had brought them all here. The hospital waiting room was quiet that morning. A few chairs lined the walls, and a coffee machine hummed softly near the corner. Outside the windows, the last patches of snow clung stubbornly to the ground. Michael sat forward in his chair, elbows resting on his knees. At his feet lay Rex. The German shepherd rested calmly on the floor, his head lowered but his ears still alert. His thick coat had begun shedding some of its winter fur, and the black and tan hair along his back shone softly in the hospital lights. Rex had grown used to the ranch life over the past few months, but he had never lost his instinct to stay close to Michael. The dog seemed to sense that this place carried tension. Lucas leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "I hate waiting," he muttered. Michael didn't respond. Waiting was something he understood too well. Hours passed slowly. Occasionally, nurses walked down the hallway, their quiet footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Finally, the doors at the end of the corridor opened. A woman stepped into the waiting area. It was Dr. Emily Parker, the same doctor who had first explained Robert's condition months earlier. Dr. Parker was a composed woman in her early 40s, with calm blue eyes and auburn hair tied neatly behind her head. Her face carried the kind of steady expression that came from years of delivering both good news and bad news to anxious families. This time, however, she was smiling. Michael stood immediately. Lucas nearly knocked over his chair. "Well?" Lucas asked. Dr. Parker approached them and folded her hands. "The surgery was successful." For a moment, neither brother spoke. The words seemed to hang in the air like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. Michael felt the tight knot in his chest finally loosen. Dr. Parker continued gently. "We removed the affected tissue, and the cancer has not spread beyond the early stage." Lucas exhaled loudly. "So he's going to be okay?" Dr. Parker nodded. "He'll need time to recover. He may never regain all his old strength." She smiled softly. "But your father should have many years ahead of him." Lucas laughed in relief and rubbed his face. Michael looked down at Rex. The dog lifted his head slightly, tail tapping once against the floor, almost as if he understood. Robert Carter left the hospital 2 weeks later. Recovery was slow. The once tireless carpenter now moved more carefully, his breathing sometimes heavy after walking long distances. But the sharp light had returned to his eyes. And for the first time in months, he no longer looked like a man preparing to say goodbye. Several months passed. Summer arrived across Montana. The wide fields surrounding Harris Ranch turned deep green under the warm sun. The ranch itself had become busier than ever. One afternoon, Daniel Harris stood beside the wooden fence near the main barn, watching Michael repair a section of gate that had loosened during the winter. The old rancher scratched his gray mustache thoughtfully. "You know," Daniel said, "I've been thinking." Michael looked up. Daniel continued, "I'm not getting any younger." Michael smirked slightly. "That obvious?" Daniel chuckled. "My knees remind me every morning." He gestured toward the ranch. "This place needs someone who knows how to run it." Michael leaned against the fence post. "You're doing all right so far." Daniel shook his head. "I mean, full-time." Michael raised an eyebrow. Daniel looked directly at him. "I want you to stay here permanently." The offer hung quietly in the warm air. Michael glanced toward the pastures where cattle grazed under the afternoon sun. Then he nodded slowly. "I'd like that." Daniel smiled. "Good." A week later, another truck arrived at the ranch. Behind the wheel was Lucas Carter. Lucas climbed out, wiping dust from his jeans. "I guess you weren't joking about this place," he said. Michael laughed. "You looking for work?" Lucas grinned. "Always." Soon, Lucas began helping around the ranch as well, learning how to repair fences and manage equipment. life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Robert moved into a small house not far from the ranch, where the fresh air and quiet land helped him recover. Most evenings, he sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the golden Montana sunset spread across the sky. And often, Michael sat beside him. Rex lay stretched across the wooden floorboards nearby. The German Shepherd had become something of a legend among the workers and neighbors. People often said the ranch wouldn't be the same without him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Michael leaned back in his chair. The sky burned orange and red above the fields. Robert sipped his tea quietly. Rex rested his head beside Michael's boots. Michael reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears. "You know," he said softly, "we made it." Rex's tail moved slowly against the wood. Michael smiled faintly. After everything they had been through, those two simple movements felt like the perfect answer. And for the first time in a long while, life felt steady again. Sometimes, the greatest miracles in life don't appear as sudden flashes of light or impossible events. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, through strength when we feel we have none left, through the loyalty of a friend who refuses to leave our side, or through the unexpected kindness of a stranger who chooses to help. Michael thought he was fighting this battle alone, working endless hours, carrying the weight of his father's illness, and pushing himself beyond exhaustion just to give his family another chance. But along the way, something greater was guiding the path. Through Rex's loyalty, through the moment Daniel Harris opened his door in the middle of a storm, and through the timing that made everything possible when hope was almost gone. Many people call that luck, but others know it as something deeper. Sometimes it is God quietly working through the people and moments around us. In our everyday lives, we may not notice those moments right away. A helping hand, a second chance, the strength to keep going when everything feels impossible. These can be small reminders that we are never truly alone in our struggles. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Stories like this remind us that compassion, faith, and perseverance can still change lives. Tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment in life that felt like a miracle? And if you enjoy stories that remind us of the goodness in people and the quiet ways God works in our lives, consider subscribing to the channel and joining this community. May God bless you and your family, bring peace to your home, and give strength to anyone who is facing a difficult road today. And remember, sometimes the miracle is already on its way, even when we cannot see it yet.